How does an empire that believed itself divinely protected come to terms with instant annihilation? Not through gradual defeat or overwhelming invasion, but through two blinding flashes that changed the nature of warfare forever. This is the story of how the atomic bombs didn't just destroy two cities, they shattered an entire worldview in a matter of days. For the Japanese military and civilians who experienced August 1945, the transformation from absolute certainty in ultimate victory to complete surrender happened so fast that many simply couldn't process it. They had been prepared to fight to the last person, to defend every inch of sacred soil with bamboo spears if necessary. Then came weapons they couldn't even comprehend. What happened in those 72 hours between Hiroshima and the Emperor's surrender broadcast wasn't just military defeat. It was the collapse of everything the Japanese people had been told about their place in the universe, their emperor's divine nature, and their nation's inevitable triumph. The atomic bombs didn't just end the war, they ended an entire way of understanding the world. To understand the shock, you must first understand what the Japanese believed in August 1945. Despite losing battle after battle across the Pacific, despite the firebombing that had destroyed 64 Japanese cities, despite starvation spreading through the home islands, most Japanese still believed victory was possible. Not through superior weapons or tactics, but through Yamato Damashi, the unique Japanese spirit that could overcome any material disadvantage. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was a worldview built over centuries, reinforced by the kamikaze divine winds that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion, by the stunning victory over Russia in 1905, by the rapid conquest of much of Asia. Japanese soldiers and civilians alike believed that their spiritual superiority, their willingness to die for the emperor, their unique place as descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu, would ultimately triumph over American material wealth. School children practiced with bamboo spears daily, learning to thrust at the vital points of American soldiers. Women trained to fight with naginata pole weapons and awls. Old men prepared to become human bombs, strapping explosives to their bodies. The entire population of 100 million was ready to die as one, believing this ultimate sacrifice would somehow produce victory or at least prevent the desecration of the sacred homeland. The military had concrete plans for this final battle. Operation Ketsu-Go called for every remaining aircraft to become a kamikaze weapon, every boat a suicide craft, every soldier and civilian a human bullet aimed at the invaders. They had hidden thousands of planes in caves and camouflaged revetments. They had stockpiled ceramic grenades and bamboo spears. They had prepared to turn the invasion beaches into massive killing fields, where American blood would flow so freely that surely the enemy would lose heart and negotiate. Consider Lieutenant Colonel Masao Inaba, a staff officer at the War Ministry in Tokyo. On the morning of August 6, 1945, he was reviewing plans for Operation Ketsu-Go, the massive defense of the homeland that would throw 28 million civilians and every remaining soldier against the American invaders. The plans called for turning beaches into killing fields, cities into fortresses, and if necessary, the entire population into a 100 million-person suicide squad. Inaba believed, as did most of the military leadership, that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome American material advantage. The morning of August 6th began like any other wartime day in Tokyo. At the War Ministry, officers continued refining their defense plans. They calculated that the Americans had lost the stomach for heavy casualties after Okinawa, where kamikaze attacks and fanatical ground resistance had killed 12,000 Americans. If they could inflict 10 times those casualties during the invasion, surely America would negotiate rather than continue the slaughter. These weren't desperate fantasies, but careful calculations. The Japanese had correctly identified the American landing beaches on Kyushu. They had positioned their forces accordingly. They knew the Americans planned to invade in November. They had months to prepare. Every detail was considered, from the placement of underwater obstacles to the timing of suicide attacks. The plans even included using schoolgirls as human mines, their bodies packed with explosives to throw themselves under American tanks. In this atmosphere of grim determination, The first reports from Hiroshima seemed impossible. Around 10:30 that morning, confused messages began arriving at the ministry. Communication with Hiroshima had ceased after reports of a tremendous explosion. A single enemy plane had been observed. Then nothing. The reports made no tactical sense. How could one plane cause such destruction? Lieutenant Colonel Inaba and his colleagues gathered around the radio, trying to make sense of fragmentary reports. Some witnesses described a blinding flash that turned the sky white. Others spoke of a massive mushroom-shaped cloud rising miles into the sky. Still, others reported that the entire center of Hiroshima had simply vanished. These accounts seemed hysterical, impossible. Perhaps it was a new type of incendiary bomb, they reasoned, or maybe multiple bombs dropped simultaneously to create the illusion of a single massive explosion. That afternoon, confused reports began arriving from Hiroshima. A single bomb had destroyed the entire city center. Communications had ceased. The reports made no sense. Inaba and his colleagues assumed it was propaganda, or at worst, a massive conventional raid being exaggerated. No single bomb could destroy a city. Their own scientists had told them atomic weapons, while theoretically possible, would take years to develop and massive resources to produce. The Japanese military wasn't completely ignorant about atomic weapons. They had their own nuclear research programs, both Army and Navy sponsored. The Army's NEGO project and the Navy's FGO project had been working since 1943 to develop an atomic bomb. But their scientists, including Dr. Yoshio Nishina, who had studied with Niels Bohr, had concluded that the technical challenges were insurmountable during wartime. The biggest obstacle was producing fissionable material. Japan's physicists calculated that separating enough uranium-235 would require 1/10 of Japan's entire electrical output and 10 years of work. As for plutonium, Japan lacked the massive reactors necessary for production. Based on these calculations, military leaders assumed the Americans faced similar constraints. Even if the United States had managed to build one atomic bomb, surely they couldn't have more than that. The resources required were simply too vast. This miscalculation would prove fatal. What the Japanese didn't know was that the Manhattan Project had employed over 130,000 workers, had cost $2 billion, more than the entire Japanese war budget, and had built massive facilities covering hundreds of square miles. The Americans hadn't built just one bomb. They had created an entire atomic bomb production system. But on August 6th, Japanese leaders clung to their assumptions. Admiral Seimu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, declared that even if it was an atomic bomb, the Americans could have at most 2 or 3, and they wouldn't waste them all on Japan. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Army Chief of Staff, went further. He doubted it was an atomic bomb at all, insisting on sending investigators to determine what had really happened. As evening fell on August 6th, a clearer picture began emerging. Reconnaissance flights over Hiroshima reported something unprecedented. The city wasn't just damaged, it had been erased. Where hundreds of thousands of people had lived that morning, there was now a flat, burned plain. The few structures still standing were hollow shells, their windows blown out, their walls cracked, standing like tombstones in a graveyard that stretched for miles. But as the hours passed, the reports grew more disturbing. Pilots flying over Hiroshima described something unprecedented. Where a city of 350,000 people had stood that morning, there was now just scorched earth and rubble extending for miles. The few communications that trickled out spoke of a blinding flash brighter than the sun, people vaporized where they stood, shadows burned into walls, and a strange sickness affecting survivors. The Japanese military's atomic research program had educated top officials about nuclear fission. They knew the theoretical possibilities, but also the immense difficulties. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear physicist, had calculated that even the United States, with all its resources, could not possibly have produced enough fissionable material for more than one bomb, if that. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, but it shaped the initial response. The Navy High Command issued a statement that even if the Americans had used an atomic bomb, they couldn't have more, and even if they did, they wouldn't be that powerful. In Hiroshima itself, the reality defied all comprehension. 20-year-old bank clerk Akiko Takakura was just 260 meters from ground zero when the bomb detonated at 8:15 that morning. She saw a white magnesium flash, then nothing. When she regained consciousness, she was trapped under debris, her back lacerated by over 100 wounds. Crawling out, she encountered a scene from hell. People walked like ghosts, their skin hanging off in sheets. A soldier sat holding, his intestines in his hands. Bodies floated in the river, so many that she could have walked across on them. What Takakura witnessed went beyond conventional warfare. She saw fingers spontaneously combusting, the fire spreading up arms to consume entire bodies. Human beings turned into living torches. The heat was so intense that people's eyes had melted and run down their faces. Birds ignited in mid-flight and fell from the sky as balls of fire. This wasn't warfare as anyone understood it. It was like the sun itself had touched the earth. The testimonies of other survivors painted an equally incomprehensible picture. 14-year-old Akihiro Takahashi was standing in line with his classmates 1.4 kilometers from the hypocenter. The flash threw him to the ground. When he stood up, his clothes were in tatters, his skin hanging from his body like rags. He stumbled toward the river, passing people whose faces had melted, leaving only their teeth visible. Some walked holding their own eyeballs in their hands. Others crawled, leaving trails of flesh behind them. At the Red Cross hospital, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya had been thrown across his room by the blast. Bleeding from multiple wounds, he made his way to the hospital to find it overwhelmed. Patients arrived with burns unlike anything he had seen, their skin peeling off at the slightest touch. Many who seemed uninjured died within hours, vomiting blood, their hair falling out in clumps. He had no explanation for these symptoms. No medical training had prepared him for radiation sickness. Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, who had been outside the city when the bomb fell, rushed back to help. He found the Hiroshima he knew had vanished. Where busy streets had been, there was only rubble and ash. The rivers were clogged with bodies, so many that the water had turned red. People begged for water, but when he gave it to them, they died immediately. He spent days carrying the wounded on his back, many dying before he could get them to help. 6-year-old Shoso Kawamoto was eating breakfast when the world exploded. The blast threw him against a wall, embedding glass in his body. His mother pulled him from the wreckage of their home, her face so burned he didn't recognize her. Together they stumbled through a city that no longer existed, passing shadows burned into walls where people had been vaporized, leaving only their silhouettes as monuments to their final moment. The scale of destruction overwhelmed any attempt at comprehension. The Shima hospital, directly under the explosion, had simply ceased to exist. Its patients and staff vaporized instantly. The Hiroshima castle, which had stood for 350 years, was gone. Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, schools, homes, all had been reduced to radioactive ash in less than a second. 15-year-old Teiko Terame was mobilized for labor service when the bomb struck. She didn't realize the extent of her injuries until days later when she found a mirror. Her left eye had been destroyed, resembling a pomegranate, with cuts across her face transforming her appearance into something she described as monstrous. Like thousands of others, she had been turned from a normal teenager into a hibakusha, an explosion-affected person, in an instant. The psychological impact rippled outward from Hiroshima. Civilians who had endured months of conventional bombing, who had steeled themselves for invasion, suddenly faced something beyond their mental framework. You could hide from regular bombs in shelters. You could fight soldiers with bamboo spears if it came to that. But how do you fight a weapon that turns an entire city into ash in seconds? On August 7th, as Japan struggled to understand what had happened, President Truman's announcement reached Japanese leaders. He claimed America possessed a new bomb harnessing the basic power of the universe, the force from which the sun draws its power. He warned of a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which had never been seen on Earth. Most Japanese officials dismissed this as propaganda. Surely the Americans were exaggerating. One bomb, even a powerful one, couldn't change the course of the war. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, Japan's 6 most powerful leaders, met on August 9th to discuss Hiroshima. The Big Six, as they were known, included Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, War Minister General Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Somu Toyoda. They were still debating whether it had really been an atomic bomb when the second piece of devastating news arrived. The meeting had been delayed from August 7th because the military members wanted more information. They still couldn't believe a single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. General Anami argued it might have been a massive conventional raid combined with propaganda. Admiral Toyoda suggested it was a special type of mine, or perhaps several bombs dropped to appear as one explosion. They grasped at any explanation except the truth that America had achieved what Japan's own scientists said was impossible. Foreign Minister Togo tried to inject reality into the discussion. He had received reports from Swiss and Swedish diplomats confirming the destruction. President Truman's statement had been clear. America possessed atomic bombs and would continue dropping them until Japan surrendered. But even Togo couldn't fully grasp what this meant. No one could. The very concept of a weapon that could destroy an entire city in seconds was outside human experience. The debate was still raging when the first catastrophe of August 9th struck. At 1 minute past midnight that same day, Soviet forces had launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. The Soviets, who Japan had desperately hoped would mediate a negotiated peace, had instead joined their enemies. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were pouring across the border, smashing through the Kwantung army that Japan had once considered invincible. The neutral party Japan had counted on for salvation had become another enemy seeking their destruction. This Soviet betrayal shattered one of Japan's last hopes. For months, Japanese diplomats had been secretly approaching the Soviets, offering territorial concessions in exchange for mediation with the Americans. The Japanese ambassador in Moscow had been instructed to offer the Soviets anything they wanted, Sakhalin, the Kurils, even Manchuria itself, if they would just help negotiate peace. Unknown to the Japanese, the Soviets had been planning this invasion since the Yalta Conference in February and had been lying to Japanese diplomats while secretly moving massive forces to the Manchurian border. The Soviet invasion was a masterpiece of military deception and overwhelming force. In less than a week, they would destroy the Kwantung Army, Japan's largest and once most elite force. The same army that had conquered Manchuria and terrorized China was being swept aside like toy soldiers. Tank corps penetrated hundreds of miles, paratroopers seized key cities, and the entire Japanese position in mainland Asia collapsed overnight. The meeting was still in session when, at 11:02 in the morning, news arrived that shattered their remaining assumptions. Nagasaki had just been hit by a second atomic bomb. Another city of 263,000 people had been obliterated. The Americans hadn't just had one miracle weapon, they had an arsenal. Everything the Japanese military had calculated about American capabilities was wrong. The second bomb destroyed more than Nagasaki. It destroyed the last argument of the military hardliners. They had insisted the Americans couldn't have more than one atomic bomb. Now they had 2. How many more did they have? 3? 10? 100? The Japanese had no way of knowing that America had no more bombs ready, that the third wouldn't be available until August 19th. All they knew was that cities could now disappear daily until nothing remained of Japan but radioactive ash. In Nagasaki, the devastation repeated Hiroshima's horror with variations. The bomb had detonated over the Urakami Valley, the center of Japanese Christianity. The massive Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in East Asia, was reduced to rubble. Of the 12,000 Catholics in the valley, 8,000 died instantly. The city's medical infrastructure, including most doctors and nurses, ceased to exist in a flash. The bomb had actually missed its intended target. Kokura had been the primary objective, but smoke and clouds had obscured the city. The B-29 boxcar, running low on fuel, had diverted to Nagasaki. Even there, clouds covered the city, and bombardier Kermit Beahan had only seconds to identify a target through a brief break in the clouds. The bomb exploded over the Mitsubishi armaments factory, but hills partially shielded other parts of the city, limiting the destruction compared to Hiroshima. Still, 40,000 died instantly, with tens of thousands more dying in the following months. Among the victims was a man who would become famous as the unluckiest person in history. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a 29-year-old engineer, had been in Hiroshima on business when the first bomb fell. Despite severe burns and ruptured eardrums, he had managed to return home to Nagasaki. On August 9th, he was describing the Hiroshima bombing to his supervisor, who accused him of being crazy for claiming one bomb had destroyed an entire city. At that moment, the second atomic bomb detonated 3 kilometers away. Yamaguchi survived again, the only person officially recognized as surviving both atomic bombings. Yamaguchi's experience embodied the incomprehensible nature of atomic warfare. He had seen Hiroshima vanish, had his body burned by radiation, had witnessed hell itself. Yet when he tried to explain it, even his own supervisor couldn't believe him. The human mind simply couldn't accept that such destruction was possible. Then, in the middle of his explanation, it happened again. Reality had become more terrifying than any nightmare. In the Mitsubishi torpedo factory, hundreds of workers were vaporized at their stations. At the Nagasaki Medical College, students and professors died instantly in their classrooms. The Chinsei Middle School lost 500 students in a second. Unlike Hiroshima, where many were caught completely by surprise, Nagasaki had received an air raid warning, but it had been called off. People had left their shelters, returned to work, resumed their daily lives. Then the sky exploded. For ordinary Japanese, the psychological shock was complete. In the countryside, farmer's wife Tomiko Higa heard the emperor's surrender speech 6 days later. Until that moment, she had believed Japan was winning. The government had told them victory was certain, that American forces were being crushed, that divine winds would protect Japan as they had against the Mongols centuries before. The atomic bombs revealed all of it as lies. The military response split between denial and determination to fight on. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, founder of the Kamikaze Corps, argued that Japan would never be defeated if they were prepared to sacrifice 20 million lives in special attacks. He believed the Americans couldn't have many more atomic bombs and that Japanese spirit could still prevail. General Anami insisted the military could still inflict such casualties on an American invasion that they could negotiate better terms. But Emperor Hirohito had reached a different conclusion. Meeting with Foreign Minister Togo on the afternoon of August 8th, before the Nagasaki bombing, he had already decided the war must end. The atomic bomb had given him the tool he needed, a face-saving reason,